get started. Hello, welcome to everyone. Welcome to those of you that come regularly. Welcome to those of you that are new to the FTD support group. We've been running the FTD support group for many years, but as many of you know, the FTD support group forms part of a larger umbrella organisation, Rare Dementia Support. And the FTD group is one of many support groups we run. The idea of this group is really to cover all of the different forms of frontotemporal dementia, but for those of you who have a family member with a language problem, we also run a PPA group, a primary progressive aphasia group. And for those of you that have a family member with a genetic form of frontotemporal dementia, we also run a familial group as well. So if you haven't heard about those, contact Nikki and her team, and those groups also meet regularly through the year. We're now doing hybrid meetings, so we will be running in-person meetings. In particular, our annual seminar is going to be always an in-person meeting, and that's usually happens early in the year in spring, and then we'll be running a couple of online groups. But just a reminder that we now have a number of small groups that meet on occasion for carers and also people who've been bereaved, as well as some small groups of people who have recently found out they carry a genetic form of frontotemporal dementia. So if you're interested in those smaller groups, please again do contact Nikki and her team. Today, the plan is really to talk to you a little bit about what's happening around the world, and you'll hear after me from Nikki. We are probably one of the longest running support groups for frontotemporal dementia around the world, but there now are lots of other support groups. And in recent years, there's a united group called World FTD United, which links support groups around the world. And Nikki will tell you a little bit about that group. And it's an important group because it shares what we do and with other groups, and we learn what other people do around the world as well. And then after that, you'll hear from Anna Volkmer, who is a speech and language therapist, about what's happening around the world. And Anna will tell you about a group she is part of, again, trying to make sure that we learn from people around the world. After that, I'll talk to you about what's happening in drug trials and in research studies, and how we link around the world with other people to ensure that we're making sure that we are really at the forefront of what's happening in research and trials. And then lastly, in terms of talks, you'll hear from Emilie Brotherhood about the work on psychological support, which is a whole new set of projects being run by the RDS team for both carers, but also for people living at risk of the genetic forms of frontotemporal dementia. And then lastly, we'll finish with a question and answer session for half an hour. Please do put your questions in the Q&A, and the Q&A can be about anything. It always can be about anything at all. It can be about symptoms you're concerned about, it can be about research, it can be about drugs, it can be about care, whatever you would like to ask questions about. We're always open to anything, and there's a team of people who can try and help with that. And usually we can answer things on the day, but sometimes Nikki and her team are able to talk to you offline if we can't. And then lastly, we'll just finish reminding you that this is really a charitably funded group, although for many of you will have found it through coming to a clinic at UCLH, at the National Hospital. We are a national group, and we're not funded by the NHS. We're funded by a charity called the National Brain Appeal, which is a charity at Queen's Square at UCLH. And so we'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing with the National Brain Appeal and some of the ways we raise funds for groups like this. So I'm going to start and just share my screen and tell you a little bit about what we know about FTD around the world. So I hope people can see my screen. So I'm going to talk about prevalence. The word prevalence means how common FTD is around the world, and then we'll talk a little bit about genetic forms, and sporadic means non-genetic forms. Then we'll talk about the differences that we know about in clinical syndromes. The reason this talk is at the start and short is that actually, of course, have been very few studies. Lots of research in frontotemporal dementia is dominated by European and American studies. But there are a sort of growing number of studies showing how common FTD is, and actually the studies in over 30 countries now. And wherever a study has been done, there have been people found who have frontotemporal dementia. When you study both young onset and older onset dementia groups and clinics around the world, then there are always people found who have frontotemporal dementia, and that is in every continent of the world. There's even been one study in Africa, in Nigeria, showing that it is present in African populations, as well as Europe, North America, South America, Asia, and in Australasia. We often get asked how common frontotemporal dementia is. Well, a few years ago, and there was a study done by the Cambridge FTD group, which is led by Professor James Rowe, where they studied every single new person that developed frontotemporal dementia in the whole of East Anglia in the UK. And they did that because there isn't that much movement in and out of East Anglia, and they managed to study through general practitioners, through every single memory clinic, through care homes, and they were able to really, within that small area, try and work out how common it was. And so they got to a number of about 11 per 100,000, so 1 per 10,000 of the population have frontotemporal dementia. So it's an uncommon condition, but not a very uncommon condition. That amounts to somewhere around 7,000 or 8,000 people currently with FTD in the UK. And interestingly, when you look at the studies in other European countries and in the US, the numbers are very similar. And so it seems to be that the how common FTD is not that dissimilar across European and US countries. The studies in places outside of the US and Europe seem to suggest that maybe it is a little less common, but of course all of those studies have actually been very small, and there are larger studies going on, and there are potentially reasons for why it seems less common. And certainly if we'd done this study in the UK 20 years ago, it would have seemed less common because it was less well understood, and many people were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Of course, many of you may have even experienced that now. Many people are still, of course, diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or a different diagnosis rather than FTD. So some of that is around education in diagnosis. So in most of Europe and the US, we say that about 1/3 of frontotemporal dementia has a genetic form. So most people don't have a genetic form, 2/3 of people, but about 1/3 of people do. And that number, interestingly, is very similar across much of Europe and the US, but in Nordic countries, particularly in Finland, it seems to be greater. So more people seem to have a genetic form, particularly Finland for some reason. One study said that about 70% of frontotemporal dementia is genetic in Finland. Then interestingly, in Asia, and most of the studies have been done in Japan and Korea, actually the vast majority of people seem to have a non-genetic form, and very few people turn out to have a genetic form of the illness. And what we do know is that actually the most common genetic form is different in different countries. In the Nordic countries, in Finland and Sweden and Norway, this gene, the C9orf72 gene, is by far the most common. Almost all the people that have a genetic form have C9orf72. Whereas when we get into southern Europe, in Spain and Portugal and parts of Italy, progranulin, which we call GRN, progranulin is the most common genetic form. In England, in the UK, we have about equal numbers of the three common genetic forms. So these two, C9orf72, progranulin, and the third form, which is tau or MAPT. And these variations across the world probably related to where a specific mutation happened. For instance, we know there's one particular tau mutation which originated in North Wales, and probably everybody who has that mutation is related to somebody who developed that mutation 200 or 300 years ago. So it can be very variable across different countries what the particular form of genetic disease is, and it seems that for some reason there are a lot less in Asia. This was a study I do just to show you that. A couple of reasons to show you this is just to really show where FTD has been studied. The slightly dark colors is where FTD has been studied, and you'll see it's actually lots of places around the world. Most of North America, not much in Central America, but some studies in Argentina and Chile and Brazil. Much of Europe has been well studied, and parts of Asia and Australasia have been well studied. This was a study looking at the percentage of the different genetic forms. But obviously there are large swathes of Europe, Eastern Europe and Russia and Africa, parts of South America where we haven't really studied things as well. But nonetheless, whenever a study is done, there always seems to be people that do have frontotemporal dementia. This is a worldwide disease, and that's important, and that'll be important I'll talk about later when we talk about how we study that. And we've had lots of initiatives to try and bring together the different research groups around the world. Interestingly, wherever you are in the world, the behavioral changes that happen seem to be similar. There haven't been many studies comparing different countries, but there was one study comparing what the behavioral changes were in UK versus Japan. Interestingly, the changes were very similar. There was only one difference, which is that although there was a change in appetite and a sweet tooth in both UK and Japan, there seemed to be more weight gain in people in the UK, and people didn't seem to gain weight in Japan, but that was one very minor difference. And actually, wherever you look in different cultures, the behavioral changes seem to be very similar across all countries. Interestingly, in the language forms in PPA, many countries, of course, people speak more than one language. And interestingly, it seems to be the later learned languages that people become more vulnerable, and people lose first. People often regress to their first language when they develop a primary progressive aphasia. And then research in FTD, well, I'll talk more about this later on. But interestingly, when we look at studies like the GEMFI study, which is a big study that we run in genetic FTD, it's dominated by white European and US participants. And that's not well understood why, and there are probably many reasons for that. But that is absolutely the case. There's lots of work really being done to drive better diversity of research participants in studies, and to understand why. Lots of cross-cultural studies. There's a new international network looking at comparing problems in different languages. And there is now increased research and genetic testing in other parts of the world to try and understand this a little bit better. So that's a sort of brief introduction, and Nikki will tell you now a little bit about where the support groups are. But it's important, I think, there are many countries without support groups, and the goal of World FTD United is try and provide the same kind of support that people get here, that we can try and help in other places around the world. And certainly we've shared, I won't preface Nikki's talk, but we obviously shared lots of things that we've done here with other people around the world. But it's important because this is a worldwide illness. Nikki, I'll let you talk.
Thank you, John, and good morning to everybody. It's lovely to be here with you this morning. Hopefully I've had some contact with most of you, but if I haven't, I'm the direct support team lead. I've got a fantastic team, and we're here to support you. I'm just trying to get my slides up, which are not working at the moment. Oh gosh, here we go. Technology. There we go. Righty-ho. So we're going to talk about World FTD United and support around the world. Sorry. Oh dear. Here we go. Sorry about that, IT issues. So we're going to talk a little bit about the RDS membership, the RDS groups that we run. We're going to continue on. John's mentioned World FTD United, so I'll tell you a little bit more about that and the global connections we have. And then we're going to finish off with World FTD Awareness Week, which happens every year. So the RDS membership, as John said, RDS has been going for quite some time now, and we've increased immensely over the last few years, especially. We're now up to 5,500 members, which is absolutely amazing considering we've got a really small team. And out of those 5,500 members, the FTD group is the largest group, and we've got 1,700 members. And then additionally on top of that, we have 1,270 members which belong to the PPA group. And these groups are a mixture of people living with a diagnosis or caring for, or family and friends, or people that are completely interested in sort of supporting people, and that may be health professionals as well. And what we're seeing as well recently is we're getting an increasing international members sort of joining us, finding us through search engines, hearing about us through different means, and signing up as members. So if we have a look at the support groups that we have, and as John also mentioned earlier, is we have support groups for each of the different types of rare dementia that we actually support. But with the FTD group, we have our annual seminar every year, and it's great that we're back doing that in person now. We'll be scheduling the next one for springtime next year, and a fantastic opportunity to come and meet others, meet health professionals, and learn a lot, and get that peer support during the day. And then we've got our online groups. So we have 2 webinars a year. So this one, and we have another one as well. And these where we bring professionals and some of our members in to do some talks, and people can learn, and it's recorded so you can go back and watch it online. And then with online support, we have a carers peer support group for FTD and one for PPA as well. I'm based on the FTD one today, and that's on Zoom once a month. Myself and Trish facilitate the group. It's a large group. We're doing 2 rooms. It's very inspiring. It's wonderful how people are sharing their experience and sharing tips and sort of experience, and sort of really feeling that bond across wherever they're living in the UK. And then we have 2 peer support groups for people living with PPA and FTD as well, and that's on Zoom monthly. And then last year, additionally to that, we joined in a FTD gene carrier group. So this is a peer support group for people who know they have a genetic mutation within the family. They've had the tests, they know that they're carrying it as well. And it's a really confidential but really supportive and inspirational group. I feel really honoured to be able to facilitate that group. And then we have regional groups. So during the pandemic, these were online. We're now out of the pandemic, so most of them are meeting face to face now. So it's a great opportunity if there's one in your area to meet people that live nearby that are caring for somebody with FTD or PPA. And there's about 10 of them over the UK. And then we've got 5 regional groups, which are all types. So they include FTD as well. So that the difference between the Zoom groups and the regional ones are mainly the regional ones are there for meeting local people and to be in person. So as I said, we're getting a lot of contact from international members now, and they want peer support as well, as everybody does. And, you know, one of our things that we're really mindful with RDS is making sure people are safe. And, you know, we want to provide these confidential spaces for people during the peer support groups, but we want to know that people are well looked after at home as well. So we've been in contact with our safeguarding teams to make sure we can incorporate some policies to enable us to do that relevant to the countries. And we are going to be inviting people to come and join our peer support groups if they've not got anything within their country, because we always think it's better if there's something local for them to do. But if they would want to join our group, we arrange a quick Zoom call with them to see what protection that they have got and what support they have locally, and then to have some name contact with some professionals that we can support them within our peer support groups, but knowing that they're safe at home. So going on to talk about World FTD United, it's fantastic that I'm part of this. I was introduced to this a few years ago, and it's an international group of organisations and health professionals who provide support for caregivers and all affected by FTD. And it is bringing that global support together, bringing the information, the resources, shared good practice, and it's a fantastic team. I really do feel very privileged to be part of this. We meet every month on Zoom, and it's very early in the morning for those in Australia, 6 o'clock. Tracy and Margie are already up, and then late at night, 9 o'clock for me and 10 o'clock for our friends in Europe, and that's Henrik Young and Laura. But it's great that we're all there together and being able to share those connections that we have. So here's the executive committee. We've got Tracy and Margaret in Australia in the pink. And Tracy is the lead for our group. Tracy came over to UK and USA in 2008. She's a neuropsychologist. She's got 40 years experience. She's a very experienced lady and such a wonderful person. She learned a lot in the UK and the USA, and then she went back to Australia and she started off FTD carer support groups, which have grown over time. Margaret is there below her. She's a clinical psychologist, very, very passionate about FTD. She actually met Tracy when her friend was diagnosed with FTD, and she's now the coordinator in Australia for FTD carers groups. The lovely lady in the lime, that's the founder. So Helen Ann is the founder of World FTD United, but she was also the founder of the USA support group, so AFTD in America, I should say. And in 1978, so a long time ago, Helen Ann's husband was diagnosed with FTD, age 78. So it's from her passion from then that all these supports started growing. And below Helen Ann, we've got Ben, who's a senior director at AFTD in America, and he's really passionate about raising awareness globally and internationally as well. He's really good at connecting those support. The rather glamorous lady with the long hair is Laura in Italy, and she's the vice president of the AFTD organisation out there in Italy. She's got family history with FTD, and she's a criminal lawyer, and she's doing a lot of research into criminal behaviour in FTD. And then below there, we've got Henrik Young, who's in Holland, also has family history as well. And he's really passionate of raising awareness nationally and globally to make sure that people are not on this journey on their own. So it's a fantastic family that I belong to here. It started in 2015, and it's increased its activity over the years. In 2020, we really joined together to get some really fantastic weeks going once a year for FTD Awareness Week. We had a marathon in 2020 where we did 8 hours in different parts of the globe. We did talks, we got health professionals involved, we got carers involved, everybody giving their experience over 24 hours, which is fantastic. In 21, we moved on to some global conversations of people's experiences. So we collected a whole catalogue of resources and recordings for that. And then last year, we talked more about the journey to diagnosis and how that differs in each country, the barriers people have, but also sharing some success stories as well. So these are all the members, the countries that are involved with World FTD. We have been growing over the years, and you can see we're reaching out to different parts of the world as well now. So we have contacts in all of these countries. I can't promise you that I know every support group in all of these countries. I don't, but we do have contact in those countries, which will enable us to find support for you. So we're just going to look at a few of the countries now. And as many of you know, we have a small sort of sister group in Canada, RDS Canada, and they are affiliated with Nipissing University in Ontario. They're running support now. So they've got a peer support group each month for carers, caring for somebody with FTD, and they're just doing an annual seminar as well. And they're starting some new studies as well of how to support children and families affected by FTD. They've got a fantastic organisation sort of that's slowly growing bigger and bigger over there. It's brilliant to see. And then in America, as I said, the association that Helen Ann started and Ben is now senior director, they provide support all over the USA. It's a fantastic organization which has got a helpline. There's lots of information and resources there. It's got a directory of support groups, and then it's got resources for people living with and caring for FTD. And one of the favorite things that I really like as well, it's got some really fantastic resources for kids and teens as well. Going down to the other end of the world now in Australia, we've got really good close connections with Australia through Tracy and Margaret and the Australian FTD Association there. And now they've got carer support groups in each state. And there's some really good connections with health professionals. And John will talk more as well about the research as well that we're doing. And they are really keen to do some future partnerships with us at RDS. We met with a couple of them when we were in Amsterdam recently on a conference, and we really hope to get some partnership working going over there. And then finally in New Zealand, we've got the Yodat group, and we've got an aphasia New Zealand. We're really lucky, as you all know, Claire Waddington, who works with us, is from New Zealand, and when she was back on holiday last year, she went and did some business sort of tours and found some really fantastic connections for us. So as I said, each year we have the FTD Awareness Week, and World FTD United are really sort of pivotal of getting involved in that. So this year, from the 24th of September to October the 1st, we'll have 8 days of awareness raising. So there'll be lots in the news, lots on social media, and it'll all be on these sorts of things. So self-care support, sustaining resilience, volunteer advocating, education and researching and celebrating as well. So it's going to be really great, everybody coming together to share their experiences. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to show this yet because I don't think it's gone out publicly, but do look out for this because this is where you'll be finding all the information. Thank you for listening, and I'm more than happy to take questions and help find support wherever you're living in the world.
Great, Nikki, thank you very much. I mean, it's really grown, and the other groups have grown over time. I think we've been probably going just about as long as FTD, but lots of the other groups are a lot newer. Great. So any questions in the Q&A to Nikki, and we'll all be there at the end to answer those things. But next, we're going to hear from Anna Volkmer, who is going to tell us a little bit about the language form of FTD PPA and how that's being studied and managed around the world.
And I think that we have a pre-recorded video from me. Yes, here we go. Perfect. Hello there, everybody. My name is Dr. Anna Volkmer. I'm a clinical speech and language therapist, introducing you to the International Primary Progressive Aphasia Speech and Language Therapy, or Speech and Language Pathology, or Speech Pathology as it's known elsewhere, network. Now, we're a group of speech and language therapy researchers who got together in about 2020 after a couple of us were chatting online about how we could support and teach clinical speech therapists who are working in general practice to help them work with people with primary progressive aphasia. Now, this is a photo from one of our meetings earlier this year, but we now have members from 15 different countries in the world, including the UK, Germany, Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, Norway, Canada, America, Australia, India, Iceland, Sweden and Switzerland. So we have around 25 members, and we meet around 4 to 6 times a year, collaborate on research ideas, try and influence clinical practice, so influence speech and language therapists, and offer each other support, because in many of these countries there are only 1 or 2 speech therapists or speech therapy researchers working in this field. Now, one of the first things we did actually is to publish a paper describing the key principles and philosophies for speech and language therapists working with people with primary progressive aphasia. So this was, you can see here the list of speech and language therapists who put together this piece of work. And we got together, this was the first group of who formed the network, and we got together and discussed using consensus methods what we thought were the most important ingredients that speech and language therapists needed to bear in mind when they were working with people. So this is a really useful tool that I always share with my student speech and language therapists, or with any speech and language therapists I know who are working with people with primary progressive aphasia, and really draw their attention to what we feel are the best practice principles. So, for example, making sure that people get to know a person really deeply, that they work on the future, so work on really practical things, but also look towards the future, and that they connect people with other disciplines, other therapists, other services they might need, as well as several other things that we recommend speech and language therapists do in this area. So that's one piece of work this group have done together. I wanted to introduce you a little bit to some of the individual therapists and researchers in this network. And first of all, I wanted to introduce you to Professor or Dr. Maya Henry. She's an associate professor at the University of Austin, or the University of Texas, Austin, and she formed the Aphasia Research Lab. Now, Professor Maya Henry, or Dr. Maya Henry, runs several pieces of research work. One of the really recent pieces of work I wanted to share with you is a review, a systematic review of all the research that's being done, all the speech and language therapy research in PPA. So she and several of her junior staff members got together and reviewed in collaboration with many other researchers what research had already been done, and they've summarized it. And I just wanted to really share this one slide. They found 101 therapy studies that have ever been written about primary progressive aphasia and primary progressive apraxia of speech, and which is a related disease. And they found that of those 101 research studies, 67 of those really focused on word practice. And many of the other research studies focused on other areas such as spelling and communication using different modalities, semantics, so knowledge of words, speech fluency, as well as discourse or conversation, and only 1 or 2 focused on areas like understanding. Now, Professor Maya Henry runs several research studies herself, and she's actually doing work on word therapy, which we often call lexical retrieval therapy studies. Professor Maya Henry, developed an intervention called script therapy, which is particularly useful when people have problems with generating grammatically intact sentences. And she also has been working on what we call multimodal therapy or total communication, looking at how people use gesture and writing and enactment or acting out of what they mean. and really looking at how effectively these interventions can be taught to people with primary progressive aphasia of all different types. One of the things Professor Maya Henry's done is look at the difference between delivering these interventions online and face-to-face, and she's really led the way in this aspect of speech therapy for PPA, really showing that there's no real difference in therapy outcomes whether they're delivered online or face-to-face, and that's really useful for us to know. It often comes down to personal preference, in our opinion, rather than necessarily the effectiveness of the intervention. I also wanted to introduce you to Dr. Stephanie Grasso. So Dr. Stephanie Grasso is one of Maya Henry's colleagues at the University of Texas, Austin, and Stephanie really is particularly interested in people who are bilingual and have primary progressive aphasia. And she's recently been doing a lot of research alongside several of our Spanish colleagues and in Barcelona and also in South America. But one of their recent studies was a review also looking at the number of papers that have been published that actually examine how to assess and support people who have bilingual, who are bilingual and have primary progressive aphasia. And they found very few studies, only 15 studies that included bilingual people. And of those, the majority of them were about how to assess people. So how can we work out if they have PPA? Only a very small number were looking at therapy for people who are bilingual. And in actual fact, the majority of these studies that were across Northern European or American countries such as Spain, Greece, Italy, the US, and only a very small proportion are across other places such as India. Now, I'm going to move to the very other side of the world and introduce you to another of my colleagues, Dr. Jade Cartwright. Dr. Jade Cartwright works at the University of Tasmania. She's also a speech and language therapist like Dr. Maya Henry and Stephanie Grasso. And Jade really focuses in on therapy around reminiscence and storytelling and narratives. And we think this is really important because actually these are newer areas in many ways, but yet perhaps are more reflective of how we talk in everyday life. So Jade has been really instrumental in exploring how people can tell stories, and she's co-produced or co-developed a therapy called Narnia for people with PPA. Jade is also particularly interested in people's experiences and making those experiences better. So she's been doing some work around people's experiences before and after being diagnosed with primary progressive aphasia and what happens to people. Still on the other side of the world, I wanted to share with you some work from Dr. Kathy Taylor-Rubin, who is a clinical speech and language therapist as well, who's done some research. And Kathy works in Sydney, in New South Wales, Australia. And one of her most recent studies was about primary progressive aphasia education and support groups, so relevant to us all here today. And she found that caregivers who attend support groups like this report that even attending one of these groups contributes to reducing worry and reducing low mood, so improving people's mood, and allows people to reduce their feelings of isolation and increase their feelings of support and knowledge about how to deal and live with PPA. And caregivers who had attended meetings reported increased feelings of well-being and support. So what's next? So the final slide I wanted to share with you was just to say that we've got heaps more work to do in this area. And actually, in our international network, we're currently working on several projects. So we're looking at group therapy, because several of us have run groups, and we're looking at what the most important components of these groups might be. So bringing all these therapy groups together to examine what were the commonalities there, what made these therapy groups effective. And we're also looking at how we can best measure the effects of therapy, because one of the main issues we have is that it's really hard to compare whether one therapy works more than another, because what we've actually found is everybody is measuring things differently. Thank you very much for listening. And if you would like to get in touch, have any questions about the studies I've mentioned, or would like to get involved in some of the research I've got on this slide, do let me know. Feel free to email me. Thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thank you to Anna. You're here in person, but the talk was virtual. But Anna will be around for some questions afterwards, and I can see there's a couple of things already coming through. Great. So back to me. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are with studies and things going on around the world. I'm going to give an update a bit on where we are with clinical trials and other things, because these are worldwide initiatives. So the biggest worldwide initiative is this project, which is called the FPI or FTD Prevention Initiative. And this is a project that's been going on for about 5 or 6 years now. And the goal of it, and it's the people involved in it include both researchers from around the world, patient groups from around the world, and charities that are interested in FTD and fund FTD research. And the goal is really to ensure that people with FTD get into clinical trials, that clinical trials are happening, and that those opportunities are open to people around the world. And so the way that we do that is try to make sure that the trials are going to happen, but also they're going to happen in the same way wherever they are in the world. And we've also created an international database of people interested in research who are eligible for trials. And we also have a focus on making sure that pharmaceutical companies work closely with us, and that they would share data back from any trials so that we understand why trials have not worked if they don't work. So at the moment, it's focused on genetic FTD, but we also do have studies ongoing around the world of non-genetic forms. In Europe, the biggest study is this one, the GEMFI study, which we run from UCL. There is a huge study really right the way across America, which is called the All FTD study, and that covers all people with any form of FTD. So I just to do one question now, person who questioned FTD, we use FTD to mean all forms of FTD, the most common being behavioral variant, the language form sometimes just being called language variant of FTD, but more commonly primary progressive aphasia. And then there are the motor forms that fit within the FTD spectrum, and those have a number of different names: PSP, CBS, motor neurone disease. So all of those come within the FTD spectrum. So the All FTD study is a large study covering the whole of the US, and the GEMFI study and the All FTD study are really the biggest studies worldwide. But there is a study in South America called the REDLAT study. There's a big study in Australia called the DINAD study, a slightly smaller one in New Zealand. And recently, our team here have been working with countries through Asia to help them set up studies in Japan, in Korea, in China, in Southeast Asia, and in India. And actually, more recently, although not quite joined the network, we've been working with an African dementia consortium. And the goal is really to ensure that whatever happens in FTD research, we all know what's happening, and that data can be shared. These are all the people who lead it, people in the US, in Australia, South America, Southeast Asia, China, Korea, India, and Japan. So, I mean, this a sort of interesting group, and it's interesting to hear what's going on in other countries. We learn a lot from what's happening in research in other countries. And we have done a number of large research projects already together as a group. Just to very quickly mention those, this was a study that involved, it's the largest study ever of people with FTD, includes nearly 5,000 people with FTD around the world, looking at the relationship between the age at which people develop genetic forms of FTD compared to the age of their parents, and then this again was a large study looking at the use of a particular blood marker called NFL, or neurofilament light, which predicted, if it was high, predicted change over time. And just to show you, we are developing this large database. You can see that already within this database, there are 1,500 people, 3,500 different visits and research visits. So the aim of this database, which is in development, is really to be able to share FTD research across the world to understand the disease better. And we can only do that by sharing data around the world. So a little bit then about trials. There are now a number of drug trials. They are focused, unfortunately, mainly on the genetic forms. I went to a meeting recently to try and talk about non-genetic forms, to really try and encourage companies to start developing drugs for that. But unfortunately, lots of the trials are focused on genetic forms at the moment. A quick go over what's happening in FTD so we can work out why we're doing things. So as we said, the risk factors for developing FTD, well, they're genetic or other. We don't know what the other is. We don't know why the non-genetic forms develop. But these lead to some pathways which lead to an abnormal protein being deposited, being put into the brain cells, which leads to loss of brain cells, and then leads to some altered level of brain chemicals. And that's what leads to the symptoms and signs of the disease. So in a very simple way, this is what's happening when people develop frontotemporal dementia. More specifically, we know some genes that cause it, and there are 3 proteins, unfortunately all these have long, funny medical names. There are these 3 proteins which are involved in frontotemporal dementia, and these problems lead to loss of brain cells, what we call atrophy in the frontal and temporal lobes, and then decreased levels of particularly the chemical serotonin, but also other chemicals, and that leads to these changes in behavior, language, motor problems. So how might we treat the disease? Going back to this, well, at the moment, we do a lot of management of symptoms. Speech and language therapy, for instance, of course, is a way of managing the symptoms of language change. And we also do this as well. We sort of restore brain chemicals. So many people, we would give a drug that increases serotonin levels because we know that is decreased, and sometimes that can help with changes in behavior. But we can't do anything beyond this. We can't do anything. There are no drugs that change the disease process at the moment. Maybe we could develop things which prevent injury to brain cells, or prevent the formation or remove these abnormal proteins, or they can change the gene and alter the gene or avoid the risk factors. If only we knew what those risk factors were, we might avoid them. So most trials actually are happening in this specific genetic form of FTD, progranulin. We know that in progranulin, these are people without a progranulin change in their gene, who have a normal level of progranulin in their blood. And these are the people who have a mutation, a progranulin mutation, who have about half the amount. The goal of all the therapies that have been developed is to increase your progranulin back into the normal level, and that's being done in different ways. Trials happen in a few phases. The phase 3 is the big trial. That's the randomized controlled trial where we compare a drug against the placebo. This is the first drug ever in FTD to get to a phase 3 trial. And this is a drug, all these drugs have funny names, latozinemab, made by a company called Electa. And it helps increase progranulin levels by blocking another protein called sortilin. This drug, it shows, this is the progranulin level, starts off low, and the drug increases the progranulin back into the normal range and does that over a long period. We can show that it decreases a protein in the blood's GFAP, which shows that there are problems with cells, and that decreases it back into the normal range. And then here it is. This is a clinical measure, a measure of a severity of symptoms, and it looks like it's changing it a little bit more than people, or a little bit less, sorry, than people who are in the GEMFI study who haven't received the drug. But these are very early results, so very small numbers, and the trial is just ongoing, hopefully coming to an end, but lots of positive things from the early data. There are other ways in which you might increase progranulin, and there are lots of companies that are doing that. These companies Prevail, Passage Bio are giving what's called an AAV. That's a working version of the gene back into the brain. That's done in this by injecting the working version of the gene into the space at the top of the spine. This is, in this company, it's by injecting the working version of the gene actually into a place in the middle of the brain. So these are very different than what we've been doing before, hugely different than any of the trials that we've ever done before, but potentially treatments for the condition. This condition, C9orf72, is a different gene. There have also been some studies happening in here. Here we want to decrease the level, because here, this is the kind of what we call the toxic peptide, the toxic protein that goes wrong. We measure that in spinal fluid. It's too high. We want to decrease that or stop it from happening. And we can use these drugs called gene silencing, but there are other drugs that are in trial as well. And we don't have any real good early results yet. Unfortunately, a couple of negative results. And lastly, this is the third main gene cause, tau. There are a number of tau-based therapies in development, but none yet trialed in people with tau mutations. And one of the roles of the FPI at the moment is developing what's called a platform trial. That'd be a trial run by academic centers, by universities. That would be a worldwide trial. That'd be a trial that we ran right the way across countries in the US, Europe, Asia, and Australasia. So there's lots of work ongoing, and in particular, there is lots of work looking at drug development in the non-genetic forms as well. I suspect there will be trials in the non-genetic forms over the next couple of years. They're likely to be worldwide trials, like all of these things, but there are none, unfortunately, in the pipeline, certainly in the next year, that I know about. But important, the only way we'll end up leading to a cure for this illness is by working with people around the world. So I'll leave that slide. That was a slide I've just put in because it was a question that somebody asked in the slot. Right. So that was a brief run through of what's happening in trials and the way we're working. I mean, it's been amazing the last 5 or 6 years to work with people. It's amazing to hear what research is going on. And I know many of you who've been involved in our research often ask, well, are we sharing data with other people? And we are, and we're certainly working with, we try not to, it's important we don't work in silos, and that we do work together and share what's going on. So if a new drug came out in the US, we'd know that that was happening, and we'd be able to try and trial that in the UK and Europe, and we wouldn't miss out on anything. So that's the importance of that, and that group now means that any trial happening anywhere will also happen here in the UK as well. So we are now going to hear, just for 5 minutes before our Q&A, we're right on time, a recorded talk from Emilie. I'm going to talk a little bit about our clinical psychology and support programs that are happening through RDS.
Hello, and thank you to everyone listening to this research section of the webinar. My name is Emilie Brotherhood. I'm a research psychologist at UCL. And some of you may recognise me as I came to speak to you earlier in the year at the FTD seminar. And this was to invite family and friends of people with FTD to tell us the triumphs and challenges that they've had with accessing health and support information about FTD online. I'm really pleased to say that we've had loads of responses, so thank you very much to those of you who have already taken part. We're also inviting you, to those of you in the audience who may not have heard of the project or may not have been aware of it, to also take part. So family and friends, but also we now have 2 new surveys which are for people specifically living with the diagnosis of FTD, and also for healthcare professionals in the audience who you may want to share your experience of different clients' triumphs and challenges of accessing support online. So this is what I'm inviting you to take part in today, and just to give a bit of context as to why we're asking you these questions. We've got some big research trials coming up where we're developing some online support for carers and family and friends of people with FTD, and also people living with the diagnosis. And so these support programs that we're developing are going to be exclusively delivered online. And the idea behind that is because it increases the accessibility, so more people can access them, and also so that you can access it either day or night, depending on what works best for you. But online delivery often has some hurdles and challenges associated with that. And so we want to learn more about those from you directly as someone with a lived experience of FTD. And so as we're developing these online support programs, we can take those into account in the design phase. And so hopefully when we come to you and ask you to tell us what you think about the programs and to interact with them, you can see that some of those hurdles have been taken out of the way for you already, and very much designed with you in mind. So how you can specifically help us, there are 3 survey links now, which I believe will be going into the chat shortly, and these are our digital access surveys. So you can complete those today. There's one survey each depending on your lived experience of FTD. So the first survey is for people who are family and friends of those with FTD. The second is for people in the audience with a diagnosis. And the third is for healthcare professionals in the audience who may have worked with people with FTD. And all 3 surveys broadly ask you to tell us about your internet use and preferences when you're accessing information and health support about FTD, your general thoughts and opinions about web-based resources, so preferences around things like Zoom or Teams or other software that you might have used and found helpful. We're going to ask you some general background questions about health and well-being. And finally, but very importantly, we're going to ask you about your views about online privacy and security, given the sensitive data when we're discussing topics such as health. All that remains for me to say is a huge thank you again to those of you who have already kindly taken part in this, and also a thank you in advance to those of you who are considering it. As I say, the links will be in the chat now, so they will take you to a separate window, and you can keep that window open as you listen to the webinar and complete the survey when the webinar is finished. Or if you'd like to look at those surveys at a later date, the links will also be included in the follow-up email that will come out shortly after the webinar is finished. Thank you very much for listening, and I really look forward to reading your responses.
Great, thanks, Emily. Please do take part in that. The links are not going to be in the chat. The links are going to be sent out to people. So if you're looking for the links, they'll be sent out rather than in the chat. But please do that. It's really important that we have our psychologists have a research grant to develop these support structures over the next few years. We need to do this in a way that people want us to do them. So please do. We're really keen to have people's input into exactly what people really want from it. Okay, so I might ask everybody then to come back online. We're almost exactly, we're just 2 minutes after 11, so we have up to half an hour if we need it for questions. So I'm going to start with a couple of PPA things for Anna. So there's a question of how to really organize speech and language therapy. for people? It's a tough question. We get asked that all the time. And I suppose it's sort of corollary to that is interested in some of these online things that are not based in the UK. Are they open to other people as well?
That's a really good question, as you say. So we always recommend as a first port of call going to see your local GP and asking them to refer you to your speech and language therapy services are accepting referrals. So they're able to work with people with primary progressive aphasia. And if they are perhaps a service that are doing this more recently, as mentioned before, we suggest that you put them in touch with us. So often I spend time advising local speech and language therapists. And your local speech and language therapy service dementia or PPA, please do get in touch with us. We can give you we can point you towards independent speech therapists, so speech therapists working in private practice who know about PPA, but we can also put you in touch with charities that might be able to support you. There is one particular speech therapy charity that may be able to support you in this way, or we may be able to give you tips and hints. Secondly, as Professor Rohrer was mentioning, there are several international studies happening. I mentioned Dr. Maya Henry and Dr. Stephanie Grasso. Their studies are international. They do a lot of their studies online, and they have participants that they work with remotely. So if they have a study open, it can be possible for them to work with you. There's also a particular team that I didn't mention because it's not led by a speech and language therapist, it's led by a neurologist, which is based in Chicago, but they deliver a multi-dimensional intervention remotely, and they work, as I mentioned, in Chicago at Northwestern University, and they have seen several people that we know that Professor Rohrer and I work with. They've seen them online as research participants. So if you're interested, and we can always put you in touch with these relevant parties.
Great. I will jump ahead because Claire is typing wildly, but the follow-up question to that, maybe I'll just clarify because your internet went a little rogue. But essentially the first port of call is to the GP and to ask them to make a referral to the local speech and language therapists. Thanks to Anna and her team, many speech language therapists around the UK now are much more informed about PPA, but if they're not, they are very welcome to contact RDS and who can put them in contact with Anna, and they can give some tips about how to manage people with PPA. But the backup to that is contacting us and us trying to put you in the right direction, either to a PPA, an aphasia charity, or tips and hints from us. So try and push along through the GP first. Not every speech therapist in the UK is fully informed about PPA, but I think I've always found them very open to having a chat with Anna and her team about things, even if they're not. That's fair. And then there are some online things, and certainly yes, people I know who've been involved in research studies not based in the UK for speech therapy. The follow-up question to that was, which is a great question because Anna, I know you do a lot of work in this, is can speech therapists support BV-FTD?
Yes, absolutely. We do support people with behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia. We support people with any type of dementia. We take an individualised, person-centred approach. It depends on the individual. But I would recommend that if you have a communication difficulty, you could benefit from seeing a speech and language therapist.
Yeah, I think it's right. And many of the people that come to our clinic, it isn't just people with PPA, many people with BV-FTD, but people with other forms of dementia do develop language problems or importantly, communication problems. and our team will see them. So that's really really important. Gosh, Anna, we're getting a run of questions. What do I do if speech language therapy is only commissioned to help me with swallowing? That's a tough question.
That is a tough question, and real that so many services are only commissioned for swallowing. It's less and less so nowadays, but get in touch with us. We can give you some tips and hints, and we can point you in the right direction, but we might be able to give you some ideas of things you can do, but also, as Professor Rohrer mentioned, the charity, or there's an aphasia charity called Discover that do some work, and we might be able to get you involved in some of the research studies I mentioned.
Right. That's really helpful. And Anna, I don't know if you know this question. It's a very specific question. The question is about the PPA staging study and about when that information is going to be published on the website. Maybe Nikki knows the answer to this. So this is a study run through the PPA support group, which was really very much a study of patients and carers to help us try and be able to tell people what stage, that we often get asked that in clinic, what stage am I at? And this was really led by patients and carers to try and do that. That paper I know has just literally been published online. It was a study led by Chris Hardy from our team. But is the plan to publish that on the RDS website or for us to distribute that?
I believe that is the plan, but I don't know what the timeline is. Nikki might know better than I.
We are in the process of redeveloping the whole website at the moment, so it's bit by bit. So it will go eventually. I think at the last PPA support group meeting, Chris did share the link with everybody. So everybody from the PPA support group would have got that at the time. But eventually, once we are ready, it will go on the website.
Great. I think if anyone is interested, the version at the moment is obviously an academic paper, but it is available online. And if you did want the link to that academic paper, perhaps less easy to read, but it definitely the tables and things are interesting, then Nikki, I'm sure we could share that if people email you and email the team. And then hopefully that'll end up on the website. Nikki, one for you. Maybe not an answer to this exactly, but maybe where to go, a sort of direction. Are there any keywords for my daughter to use when gently explaining to her 6-year-old, her granddaughter, what is happening to my husband? Our granddaughter has started noticing he's changing. I know, Nikki, you mentioned, and we have used these before, some of the resources from the AFTD.
Yeah, the AFTD website has got some really fantastic resources for children, especially for young children. They put it in sort of character and sort of cartoon ways of gently introducing the behaviour changes and sort of being wary slightly and how to change your behaviour around sort of the person living with the diagnosis. It might be something that's quite personal to them. As we know, everybody knows people with FTD have got such a wide range of symptoms. So it sometimes can be quite personalized of what we have to do with that. So whoever put that question in, if they could please get in contact, and we'll definitely work with you to do the best resources and sort of script for you to work with at home, because I think that would be really helpful.
Right. I am just going to quickly share my screen again, because just to answer a couple of questions. So I quickly threw these together. Okay, so people asked a bit about the prevalence, so how common it is at different ages. So remember, the overall, when you look across all lifespan, is 11 per 100,000, but of course that's different at different times of life. So actually, of course, if you just look at people between 60 and 64, 65 and 70, the how common it is much more. And you can see that the sort of peak is through the late 50s and into the early 80s. And so important to say that FTD, of course, can happen in 70s and 80s. Once you get to 40 and below, someone asked how common it was 40 and below. Well, this is less than 1. And then if we look at this bit, this next slide, this is divided into the different groups. When you look at 0 to 44, really this means this is people with behavioural variant FTD. Below 44, it's about 1 per 100,000. So really very, very uncommon below that age. Now, someone asked the kind of prevalence of non-fluent variant PPA. Well, here it is across, roughly PPA is that's 11 per 100,000 splits roughly into 3. A third of that is behavioural variant FTD, a third of the motor forms, and a third are PPA. And the PPA forms are about equal. And so you can see here, this black line is non-fluent variant PPA at different ages. So for instance, here between 60 and 64, 65 and 69, it's about 4 per 100,000. In early 70s, about 5 per 100,000. So in the different ages, about 4 or 5. Across the ages that we see it, it's about 4 or 5 per 100,000. People asked about genetic testing. So this is data that we use and think about. It's often the data I tell people in clinic. So we can score people. A score of 1 means there are more than 3 family members with FTD. A score of 2 means 3 family members. A score of 3 means there's just 1 person, but it's 1 person with a young onset dementia. And then 3.5, 3.5 is 1 family member, but an older age onset FTD, and 4 is no family history. This is our risk if you came to see me in clinic, if you had FTD and you came and told me that there were that many numbers of people with FTD in your family. Of course, if you told me there were 3 people with FTD in the family and you also had FTD, very high risk, nearly 90% of us finding a genetic cause. That risk goes down with the fewer members of family that are with FTD. But even when there's no family history, the risk is still about 7%. The risk is not 0. But the risk is different for the different forms. And it's much more for behavioural variant FTD or FTD when it overlaps with motor neuron disease than the other forms. And these forms, the PPAs and the motor forms, are extremely rarely genetic. So 95% of non-fluent variant PPA will not be genetic, less than 5 will be. For semantic variant, less than 1%, so 99% of the time it will not be genetic. If you look at behavioral variant FTD, the risk is here. So the risk, for instance, if you have 1 family member who's got a young onset FTD and you also have BV FTD, the risk is about 60%. But the risk here is if you have FTD and there's no family history, the risk is about still about 10%, about 13% here. So when people come see us, we generally advise we offer genetic testing to all people with behavioral variant FTD. We only offer testing to people with the language forms or the motor forms if there is a family history, because it's so uncommon and so rare in the other forms. But the questions were, let me just get my question list back up. One question was, my husband is post 10 years diagnosis. Is it too late to do a gene test? It's not too late to do the gene test. And certainly if people come to see us with behavioral variant FTD, we do talk to people about that. There are some complications when people can't consent to it, but those are things we often discuss with people. And certainly 5 years ago, we wouldn't have done that, but based on this data, we do now offer testing. And maybe same or different person said, how can we be sure about it's genetic or sporadic? You can only be sure if you do the test. But as I said, the risk in the PPA forms is extremely uncommon, extremely unlikely. And in the absence of a family history, very, very, very unlikely in primary progressive aphasia, but that's different for behavioral variant. So one question about trials. It's a very specific question. Do I think the PREVAIL trial will have a placebo arm when they commence the phase 3? So the question, Prevail is one of these drugs that increases progranulin levels by injecting a working version of the gene into the space just at the bottom of the brain. At the moment, it's in very early phase. The difficulty with doing a placebo trial when it's an injection into the head or injection into the brain is understandably most regulatory authorities, most of the authorities in countries that decide on how trials are done don't really want people to be in studies where they get an injection into the head, which has lots of risks, and then they don't get the drug. So that's complex and nobody quite knows the answer to that question yet. It's a very specific question. I think it may be that there won't be a placebo arm, but they'll then have to think about how they do it. One of the ways of comparing data in a trial like that will be to use data from one of the studies like GenFi or All FTD, where we've studied people over many years who have this illness without a drug, and that's one of the ways that these companies are thinking about doing the studies. And then there's a question about treating symptoms of agitation. The question is about medications, but maybe I'll come to Nikki first, because actually the best ways to treat agitation are without drugs. And maybe, Nikki, you and your team often do think about that question a lot.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one we get asked all the time, to be quite honest. And it's really looking at what the agitation is and what the triggers are. And quite often the agitation is just a distressed reaction. It's not being able to communicate, whether there's pain, whether there's distress for another reason. Perhaps somebody's very much annoying that person. Perhaps there's some behaviours, perhaps some environment that's going on. So we look at all the environmental issues behind it, all the bits of personal space, about communication, how people are doing that, body language, people being asked to do things they don't want to do and being told they're non-compliant. So it really is a very person-centered issue. So looking really at those triggers that are setting them off first of all, to see what, if anything, is causing that. And we quite often use a model we call the cause model, which will look through all these different elements about communication, about sort of the activities they're doing, whether they're unwell, their sort of life story, the environment, and looking at different things to see what could possibly be causing that agitation. And then we look at things for distraction, things that bring comfort, bring reassurance to that person. So it's very much sort of looking at what the actual issue is and how we deal with the triggers to prevent it happening, limit the collateral damage with it, but what things we can put in place to help restore some sort of harmony and equilibrium. So I hope that'll help to start off with.
Yeah, and so the follow-up to that, I think, and that's important, to always think that when we think about later stage behavioral change, it's really important that we think about the non-drug ways first. Usually what community mental health teams will do is they will have a think about what the risk benefit is at that stage. If those things haven't helped and there is no benefit from that, and the question comes down to a little bit around safety, both safety for the person and safety for other people in the family, then often a small dose of what's called an antipsychotic drug, a drug that's used commonly in conditions like schizophrenia, those can be used. And they are sometimes used. They do not come without their risks, and they can cause side effects like other motor symptoms, becoming more stiff, difficulty with walking. So they do need to be very carefully used, and they need to be carefully used by someone who is used to prescribing them, and someone who is going to monitor them. And that would usually at that stage be either the local psychiatry service or the local community mental health team. So the answer to that is yes, but it is it's really a kind of multidisciplinary approach to agitation and later stage behavioral change that needs to be thought very carefully about, rather than jumping in and giving medication straight away. It does not come without its risks of giving the medication. Does it help to have a strong routine? The answer to that is yes. And Nikki, I spend a lot of time in my clinic talking to people about routines. Nikki, what would you say?
Yes, one of the most common symptoms we see is compulsions and sort of fixations on doing things. So having a really good routine throughout the day and throughout the week, and planning that routine as well, and planning it with the person that has that diagnosis, to put those things in the routine that they really are fixated with and they like doing because it's enjoying, and sort of perhaps doing a weekly planner with that, not just a daily planner, a weekly planner in advance, so they feel really part of it, really involved with what we're doing. And in that planner, have spaces in different parts of the days for all your friends and family to help with you, because doing that on your own is really, really exhausting. And we all know that sort of friends and family often come by and they say, oh, if there's anything I can do to help, let me know. And people say, I'm sure they don't mean it. You have 5 things in your back pocket, basically, to say to them, this is what you can do. And you have that planner put on the fridge in the kitchen with those spaces every week. So when people come by and say, look, got a couple of hours free on a Wednesday afternoon, why don't you take Margaret out for a cup of coffee and a nice cake? She'll love that. And that's really, really helpful for your sanity and enjoyment for the week, and also gets many people involved as well.
Yeah. Anna?
I just wanted to add that it's often really useful to make those plans visual. So use photos of people or places and to make them really accessible for the person.
Great. So there's a question. My husband is non-verbal, but whenever he has an infection, his speaking improves. It's happened a couple of times. Anna, any ideas why that's happening?
I don't know, if I'm honest. It's very difficult to understand when people develop infections. They often may develop a delirium, and so they may behave or communicate in different ways. And you're not the first person who's mentioned something like this, but I really don't know why that happens. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think the change in the brain that comes, of course, for most people, an infection comes with more confusion, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how one might prevent urine infections or chest infections, which we know are the most common triggers for a period of acute confusion. But actually, interestingly, though, it's probably one of the most common illnesses of an inpatient in hospital. It is extremely poorly studied, and we know very little about what's happening in the brain when people develop what has 2 names really: acute confusion, or what traditionally called delirium, and common, of course, in people with dementia, easier to trigger in dementia than people without dementia. And we understand it very poorly, but many of you will have experienced that when there is even a minor urine infection, a sudden change in behavior and things. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how we might prevent some of those things. So I think we've come to the end of questions, which comes nicely really to time. We are always open to questions. Please do send us anything at all. And I just have a look. Oh, one last question. Does delirium make you less inhibited and more likely to talk about feelings? I think you probably aren't cognizant enough to talk about feelings, but certainly people are, I think, but part of delirium is being slightly less inhibited in some ways. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Nikki and Claire and Sam and her team, as always. Hopefully that gave you a little taste of something a bit different than we normally talk about, an idea of what's going on. I sort of feel it's always reassuring to me that that there are other people around the world who are looking into this and researching it and trying to manage it, and reassuring to us to know and to learn what's going on around the world. And I've certainly learned a lot from working with people in other countries, both in my day-to-day practice, but also in the way that we do research, and certainly the way that we will get to better treatments, better care. Hopefully a cure for this illness will be by working with people really around the world to do it. So thank you all for attending today. Thank you to Anna and to Emilie as well for speaking. And hopefully all see you next time. Nikki, remind me when the next meeting is.
We don't have the dates yet.
Don't have a date
We'll be planning in September. I need a holiday first.
To be planned. We're in the middle of summer, so to be planned later in the year. So see you all later in the year, and we'll be in touch when the next meeting is. Thank you all very much.
Hello, my name is Eva Tate and I'm the Major Appeals Manager for the National Brain Appeal. The National Brain Appeal is the charity that raises much needed funds for the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and the UCL Queen Square Institute of Neurology, altogether known as Queen Square in London. It is our aim as a charity to improve the lives of people living with neurological conditions across the UK. And at the moment, that is amounting to around 1 in 6 of us, including rare dementias. We have been funding rare dementia support since the beginning, and certainly since it was formalised in 2016. Over the past few years, we've been aiming to raise up to £350,000 a year to be able to improve and accelerate the services available to people. And in line with that expansion, and you'll know that there's now more than 5,000 members of RDS across the UK and some worldwide. We have committed as a charity to raise up to £7 million to create the world's first rare dementia support centre. This will be a permanent home for RDS and will be created around 3 key pillars, which are support, education and research for professionals, healthcare professionals, and also research into what type of support is most helpful to people living with these conditions, their families and friends. We have found a site for the centre and are well on our way to creating this fundraising goal. We've raised well over £1 million and have had some very high profile support over the past couple of years. Most notably in the last 6 months, Richard Walker, the group chairman of Iceland Foods, has climbed Everest for us, a truly remarkable feat. And 30,000 colleagues at Iceland Foods have been raising money for the Rare Dementia Support Centre over June during their fundraising weeks. So thank you very much to them. But we've also had lots and lots of supporters who have done incredible races, runs, walks. We've had people travel across the Mongolian steppe raising funds for us, across the Pyrenees, and also people doing bake sales and all sorts of community events as well. We'd like to thank each and every one of you, all the people who have taken part in fundraising and who continue to take part in fundraising. There is some match funding available for anybody who would like to raise funds for the centre. And I would encourage you to get in touch with a member of my team, with myself or any member of the National Brain Appeal team who can help to support you and encourage you in any of your efforts. We also had a garden at Chelsea Flower Show this year where the designer Charlie Hawkes worked with members of RDS, particularly those living with posterior cortical atrophy, to create an incredibly beautiful garden that went on to win 3 medals, one of which was a gold at Chelsea. So we're absolutely delighted by the awareness raising that this brought about and all the coverage on BBC. The garden has now moved to Exbury Gardens in Hampshire, and it's free to visit by anybody who's a member of RDS and their carer. We hope that it being in Hampshire will allow more people to be able to visit than were able to visit Chelsea. And ultimately, we hope that that garden will be able to move to the Rare Dementia Support Centre when it's ready to be able to accept it. Thank you again, and I encourage you please just to contact us if and to follow us also on social media. That you'll hear a lot more news about what's happening at RDS in terms of fundraising, and you'll also be able to keep up to date with any of our activities that we are planning over the next couple of years. Thank you again. And we really are looking forward to making sure that this centre is a real home from home for those living with these conditions, their families and friends. Thank you again.
My name is Stephanie Still, and I'm the Senior Fundraising Officer at the National Brain Appeal. I'd like to start off by saying thank you to anyone who's fundraised for us in the past. You are fantastic and your efforts are really valued. I have a wonderful job at the National Brain Appeal because I get to look after all of the fundraisers who want to take on an activity to support us. Over the years, we've seen people take on incredible challenges like marathons, taken on triathlons. We've even had a few who've braved a skydive. We've also had wonderful fundraisers who've brought together friends, family and colleagues to host a coffee morning or to arrange a golf day or carol concert, you name it, to support RDS. Our fundraisers enable RDS to keep running and mean we can continue to support people like you. So if you're interested in becoming a fundraiser or you'd like to fundraise again, I will be here every step of the way to support you. If you might be interested in taking on an active challenge like a run, swim or walk, there are a range of suggestions on our website of upcoming events that you could take part in. Or if you're like me and aren't really into sporting activities, then there's still a range of things that you can do to support us, from bake sales to coffee mornings, and I'll be here to make suggestions and to help you think up ideas. I really hope to hear from some of you, and we'll be here to help you make a successful, fun fundraiser. Thank you.